Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Goldster Inside Story. As you know, it's our Agatha Christie month. We're nearly at the end of it, but we've saved one of the best till last. So this today is Andrew Eames. This is his book, The 8:55 to Baghdad. And Andrew's actually got the paperback version, which has an even funkier jacket. I read this a few years ago and I loved it. I've been longing to get him on to Goldster. So when I knew we were doing the Agatha Christie month, I thought, right, we're going to ask him on. He's done lots of other books. We're not just talking about his Agatha Christie style book today, but we are going to talk about all of his writing. So Andrew, welcome to Goldster. Thank you so much for coming along today and to talk about a book which I'm sure you feel, oh my goodness, I did that years ago. Isn't that done and dusted?
Yeah, it's actually, I had to refresh myself. I was flicking through it this morning and thinking, God, I was quite good then. No, I think it was a good concept. It combined two really juicy stories, I thought, which is the surprisingly, adventurous life of Agatha Christie, the sides of Agatha Christie that people didn't really know about, and one of the big political hotspots at the time, which was the Iraq War, which was just about to kick off. So I didn't deliberately, get involved with the Iraq War, but it so happened that I arrived on my Agatha Christie research at the time when things were starting to happen in Baghdad.
And because I did the same journey as you, and I read this book when I was about to go on that journey, but by the time I did it, the war was well and truly in place, and I could only get as far as Jordan. Went through Syria, which was amazing, but had to stop in Jordan. And I just found it really fascinating. I'd love to have managed to do that whole journey. So tell us about the inspiration behind this book. What was it that made you think, I'm going to recreate this journey?
Well, you mentioned Syria. I traveled for work reasons to Syria a couple of times in the late 90s and thought it was a wonderful place. Really like stepping back into some pages of the Bible, really, Crusader castles and ancient souks and donkey carts coming down through all the stalls of all the traders, and people from countries like Armenia that I didn't really know anything about, all in these trading towns. And I thought, what a wonderful place. I had no idea of what was going on underneath the surface, of course, of Syria at the time, with all the tensions there. So I just thought it was a great place to be a tourist. And I ended up in Aleppo, which of course has had such a bad time since then. And the souk at Aleppo was something magnificent. And I stayed in a hotel called the Baron, which is a very old-fashioned traditional hotel run by an Armenian guy. And in the course of conversation, he said, oh, you must meet my mum, who's from the old country. He was a very old-fashioned guy. And I had tea with him and his mum mentioned that Agatha Christie had been to tea on a regular basis and had been a regular guest in the hotel. And this didn't compute with my concept of Agatha Christie, which is all about English vicarages and croquet and strange murders on suburban trains and things like that. So when I got back to the UK, I started looking into it a little bit more, and I realized that actually she'd spent something like 15 or 20 years in that part of the Middle East, and she'd been then working and living on archaeological digs with her second husband. This is a side of her that I had no idea existed. So I kind of looked into the background of it and realized that there was an episode in her life, a very famous episode, where her first marriage to Archie Christie was breaking up, and she went missing for 10 days, there's been films made about it and books written about it since then. And after that, when she was kind of trying to rebuild her life, she went on this surprisingly exotic journey from London to Baghdad by train. And I just thought, what a wonderful journey to try and do in the modern era. I love trains. I'm quite a fan of Agatha Christie, and it just seemed like a perfect combination.
And so you retrace it, because at the beginning you start off and it's kind of wonderfully suburban, isn't it? And then you really follow. Tell us about how you decided to do all that. Did you know the exact route that she'd done, or did you have to find that out?
Well, in those days there were two great trains. So the Orient Express, which went all the way to Istanbul, and then there was a train called the Taurus Express, which went from Istanbul to Damascus, which was an equally glamorous train full of spies, apparently, in its day. And so those two trains kind of still exist. There's the new version of the Orient Express, which is the Venice Simplon Orient Express, which actually only goes to Venice from London. And then there is a train called the Taurus Expressi, which goes across Turkey and stops at the Syrian border. And actually it has a coach attached to the back of it, or it did, which is from Syrian Railways. And that Syrian coach, that single Syrian coach attached to the back of the modern Turkish train, then gets detached and shunted over the border in the mountains and taken all the way to Damascus. So I thought I could still do that. I can do that journey. So that's how I plugged it all in. And I had to stitch together the bits between Venice and Istanbul with a lot of regional trains. And while doing that, I was able to stop off at quite a lot of places that Agatha Christie had also stopped off at other stages in her travels. And she was quite an avid traveler. She got around a bit.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. I very early on in Goldster, we read of our book of the month. We read her non-fiction book, Come Tell Me How You Live, about her life on an archaeological dig, which I just find a really interesting social document apart from anything else. So fascinating. And I remember some years ago, I think the first got me interested in it was going to see an exhibition at the British Museum called Agatha Christie and Archaeology, because the British Museum sponsored Max Mallowan and her second husband, and they had all sorts of wonderful things there. And they had a carriage from the Orient Express. And it was just the kind of beautiful marquetry, the amazing kind of design of, the way that the hand basin came out from the side, and all sorts of just a wonderful thing. And it really stuck with me. So
it is wonderfully authentic. Even the contemporary, the modern Orient Express still has, well, I don't know if they've changed it actually. It still has just a lavatory down the end of the corridor and a sink in your room.
Yeah.
And if you're paying a lot of money, which all the travelers are, particularly the Americans, they're amazed that there are no ensuite facilities. So you still have to sashay down the corridor in your leopard print dressing gown.
Yes, how fantastic. So how many times have you traveled on the Orient Express then?
Only that once. And I don't think I particularly want to do it again. I think it's a strange thing to do as a single person. Everybody looks at you across the dining room thinking, what the hell's that person doing? Why is he making notes? And why is he looking at me so intently? And yeah, I was aware that I was a little bit of a fly on the wall, because it's such a thing that people do for anniversaries and special occasions. So as a single man there's an element of suspicion over you, I think.
I found that when I was travel writing, people always look at you askance when you're sitting by yourself in a restaurant, and as you say, taking notes, because what else are you going to be doing? And there's definitely, and I just thought that was because I was a single woman. So obviously it happens to single men as well.
Well, these days with mobile phones, of course, you can just engross yourself.
That's very true.
And you're showing the world you've got friends after all.
Whenever I see solo travelers, I think, I bet they're a travel writer.
There's a good chance, yeah.
So you tell us about your career in travel writing. So when did you realize that you loved travel, or was it something you kind of fell into?
Actually, I went on the road almost as soon as I left university, and I ended up in Southeast Asia as a TEFL teacher, teaching English as a foreign language, which had always been part of the plan. I always intended to kind of travel and then maybe settle somewhere and work for a few months or a couple of years, and then maybe come back again. I had no real plan for the rest of my life. So I was just playing it as it went along, really, playing it by ear. And I ended up in Singapore, which was a very nice place to be at the time, very sophisticated, but very well located for lots of really interesting countries. So Malaysia and Thailand and Indonesia and Laos and Cambodia, all those places, very easily accessible from Singapore. But Singapore, being very sophisticated, was a great place to come back to after you've done a quick sortie out to all those destinations. So once I'd been teaching for a while and traveling from Singapore out to the neighboring destinations, I bumped into somebody who was working for the Straits Times, and the Straits Times is the local Singapore newspaper. And in those days, it had a secondment from the Times of London of section editors. And I bumped into one of these section editors, and she said, well, we're desperate for people to start writing for the newspaper who can write properly in English, because the Singaporeans have their own version of English, and it works very well there, but it doesn't come out terribly well in print.
Yeah.
So I started traveling around, writing a couple of pieces and coming back and doing my TEFL teaching. And then after a while, the writing became bigger than the teaching. And so I ended up being kind of on the road most of the time, going to the surrounding countries and coming back and filing stories in the Straits Times. And that's kind of how I started. And then when I came back to the UK after about 2 years of that, I realized I knew a lot about Southeast Asia. This is the early 1980s. A lot about Southeast Asia, just when it was becoming tourism destination, just when long haul tourism was kicking off and people were suddenly interested in Thailand, for example. When I first went to Phuket, there were just bamboo huts on the beach and a couple of Vietnam GI veterans behaving very strangely, living in bamboo huts on the beach in Phuket.
Wow.
Now it is just transformed.
Yeah, that must be so fascinating to have seen such a change. And so as a travel writer, do you sometimes think, God, tourism is a nightmare. Maybe I shouldn't be promoting this, because I know it's quite a difficult thing sometimes.
Well, I think it's a great exchange of, human exchange, where different parts of the world can meet up and exchange ideas and see that the other part of they're not got very strange behavior. They're not got, there's a lot in common wherever you are in the world.
Absolutely.
And I think travel is a great communal exchange. And I think without it, we'd all get up, our prejudices would exaggerate and we'd have more wars probably.
Yeah.
I can't point to an example where tourism has stopped war, but it surely does help communication, and more communication we have, surely the better and safer a place the world's going to be.
Yeah. So tell us about your first book, Crossing the Shadow Line.
Yeah, so that was the result of that first travel in Southeast Asia. And I when I was a university student, I did a thesis about Joseph Conrad, who is he's a originally Polish author, and his first working life was as a merchant seaman, and he was on ships mainly in the Far East, in Indonesia and Malaysia. And so I was kind of inspired by that. Was one of the reasons why I went out to Asia in the first place. And one of the big journeys I did was on a Indonesian sailing boat down all the islands from Bali down to Papua New Guinea, and then from there to Australia. And we didn't have any navigation equipment on board. So actually most of the time that didn't matter because you were kind of island hopping. But the bit from Papua New Guinea to Australia to Northern Territory, we had to navigate with a transistor radio. And if you know, with Darwin, there's a radio station in Darwin which was broadcasting popular music. And if you move a transistor radio around, you get a stronger and a weaker signal, and you can locate where the beacon is.
Right.
Broadcasting. So that's how we identified where Darwin was and how we were going to reach Darwin. And that worked. And if we'd missed, then either side of Darwin, the Northern Territory, Australia, there is nothing. So we would have ended up in the soup, really.
How fascinating.
So that was one of the big journeys, but there were lots of other sort of more subsidiary journeys in that book that I put together. And it was all about coming of age, really, in the Far East. And
what was it that made you decide to write it as a book? You just feel you had a book in you, or was it?
Yes, I mean, they had this one thread of the big journey, and it just seemed like when I came back and people were talking to me about my experiences out there, and people seemed very interested. I think if I pitched it now, I think I'd find it much harder to sell. Well, because it's not such a current destination, but also because it's almost like a series of articles rather than one book.
Yeah.
And a book really needs to have a beginning and a middle and an end and a progression. I mean, the progression in it is me coming of age, as it were, but they are individual episodes. And actually, if I was an editor now, I would probably say, well, actually, this guy should be just writing a series of articles rather than pitching it as a book.
Yeah. And so what happened after that book? Did you then get encouraged to do more, or did you just think, I'm going to come up with all these ideas?
Yeah, so I then wrote a very similar one, well, not similar, but a similar structure one about Scotland. My mum is from the Isle of Skye, and we always went there, every year, me and my cousins, for our sort of annual family pilgrimage. And so somewhere it's always been very important to me. So when the publisher said, because the first book, Crossing the Shadow Line, did very well, it just sort of hit a sweet spot, I think. My publisher said, well, what's next? So Scotland seemed to be, a subject close to my heart. So I thought I'll do Scotland. And I did it in 4 journeys at 4 different seasons a spring, a summer, and an autumn and a winter journey. And I thought it was a good book, but when you write a book about Scotland, the reviewers tend to be Scottish people. The editors ask Scots to review this book about Scotland, and they were kind of, what does this guy really know about Scotland, really? So it didn't sell.
Yeah.
It didn't really sell. And after that, there was a long period, because I didn't sell very well in the second book, long period where I actually didn't write a book for a long, long time.
And then this was your next one, the 855 to Baghdad.
It was, yeah. Yeah. So that was the next one. And that was, as I say, it was inspired by the curious coincidence of going to Aleppo and coming across the footsteps of Agatha Christie, who had her hair done in Aleppo, went shopping in Aleppo. I had no concept of that part of her life.
I thought that was wonderful, reading about her coming into Aleppo, especially to have her hair done and things. Yes. And I loved Aleppo. I have incredibly fond memories of it. And when I look at the news, it just breaks my heart to see what's happened to that amazing place where people were incredibly friendly. And I just had plans to go back again. And it must be very difficult for you when you've been to so many places like this and you've seen the changes. I mean, we've talked about the changes you've seen with tourism, but when you go to somewhere like Syria and you then see the changes that are happening, how does that make you feel? Do you think you feel more of a deep connection because you've been writing about them?
Yes, I feel a deep connection. I must admit, if something bad has happened in a place, I don't want to go back there. And also, if I've had a really good experience somewhere, I think, well, I don't want to go back. I mean, like going back, I talked briefly about Phuket a while ago. I did go back and put my foot inside the main sort of urbanizations of Phuket quite by chance about 3 years ago. And I couldn't wait to get out of there, really. And it was destroying my lovely memories of what a place had been like. So yeah, tourism does do that. But I'm also aware that that kind of tourism gets people out who otherwise wouldn't be. They'd be a little bit scared about going unless there were some big brand hotels, unless there was a Starbucks on the corner and a KFC. That does encourage people to go. And I think people should travel if they can afford it. So although personally, if a place has been very well developed by tourism, I will generally avoid it. I'll try and find somewhere else. I can see good reasons for it. It does usually boost the local economy enormously. What I don't like to see is really the big all-inclusives where people pay money here to have everything provided there, so they don't go with any money in their pockets to spend on local things when they get there. That is a sad development in tourism.
Yes, I remember being in the British Virgin Islands and a cruise ship came in and everyone was really cross. And I said, oh, I'd have thought that would be a really good boost for the economy. And they said, not at all. They come off the boat having paid already in advance for everything that they do. They may buy a single beer in a bar. They said, we'll get people who leave and go back to the boat to have lunch because it's included in their price. Rather than spending, and this was 20 years ago, a couple of dollars buying lunch at a local place, they will actually spend the time to go back onto the boat in their one day on this island to go back and
I would probably do that. I would probably do it. Having with a Scottish background, if I've spent the money and it's there, I'm going to go and get it. I'll probably be equally guilty. But yeah, it's not a good look for the tourism business. And the money, of course, is going to big business, and very little of it is trickling down into the local economy.
I do think that things are getting better. I think that cruise companies and things are starting to learn that they need to work with local economies. And I hope that that is the way forward. Maybe I'm naive, but I hope that that is the way forward, with a lot more tourism, that looking at spending money on local people rather than just getting it all done by the great big conglomerates. And I think there's more, there's definitely a move individually towards people saying, well, I want to do more ecotourism. And of course, when people start realizing that ecotourism is a word that people recognize, of course, the big companies will start going, oh, we need to look at our green credentials and start doing ecotourism. So maybe it will
washing down.
Yeah, greenwashing, absolutely. So as a journalist, tell us about your career, how you got into journalism. And I know that quite a few people here today might be interested in doing journalistic work. So I might ask you for some tips later on as well. But what did you start doing other than travel?
So when I came back from the Far East, I went into trade publications. So Freight News International Weekly was my stamping ground. So I was writing about cargo ships and containers and all the rest of that. And I loved that, actually, because I like ports. I'm a boy, really. I like transport in general. So I like trains and planes and ports. So I used to go stamping around all the ports of Europe and seeing how many container ships they were welcoming and all the rest of that. So that was good fun. But then after a while, I got a little bit bored of that, and I moved more into consumer stuff, consumer magazines. And actually, I then moved and became a sub-editor on the Times for a while. And I was very fortunate because it was at the time when there were big industrial disputes at the Times, and a lot of they were moving from Fleet Street to Wapping, and they got rid of a lot of their staff. So they suddenly needed a shed load of people who weren't really experienced enough to come and fill some of the positions, fill the seats. So I was one of those who really didn't have the requisite experience. So I got in kind of luckily by the back door, but it was a great learning curve. I used to work on a shift that started about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and worked through to midnight, going through all the various editions and subbing it and putting in the headlines on and welding bits of copy together. So that was a great learning experience. And then from there, I kind of became more of a sort of freelance and started pitching to other newspapers, knowing a little bit how newspapers worked. So I started pitching features, general interest features, not necessarily just travel, to all sorts of different newspapers, which is pretty much what I've been doing ever since.
And you've just come back from Vietnam, is that right?
That's it, yeah.
So that's something you're writing at the moment. What was that? What was that
So
like?
yeah, so Vietnam, it's the 50th anniversary next January of the American withdrawal from Vietnam, the end of the Vietnam War. And if you look at Wikipedia about the amount of films and the amount of books generated by that war, it is huge. I mean, if you think about titles like Apocalypse Now and The Deer Hunter, the whole reverberation of that war was enormous. And the protest movement that started, the protest movements that started as a result of the Vietnam War in America and in the UK and all over Europe, it was an earth-shaking time, really. So it's a good peg. When you're a feature writer looking to sell ideas to newspapers, you need a why now reason for the editors to say, yes, we should do coverage for this. So I thought that the 50th anniversary of this huge event that people have kind of forgotten about a little bit was a good moment to start selling some travel stuff, because basically I went there and traveled around and talked to people about the destination and see what's happened to it in the 50 years since. And I found, almost to my amazement, that the war is almost completely forgotten in Vietnam.
Wow.
Almost completely forgotten. Over 50% of the population is under 30, so it's not in their living memory. A lot of the people who were affected by it are the boat people who left. They're not there anymore. And the older age group don't particularly want to talk about it. They're looking to the future all the time. So there was me going around asking people about the war, and the locals are saying, "What war? What are you talking about?"
And I learned when I was in Vietnam to call it the American War, not the Vietnam.
The American War, yes.
Yeah, which is,
although it did go on a couple of years after the Americans withdrew, because it was basically the communist North against the South. And once the Americans had gone, the North did prevail, but it did take them another year and a half before they prevailed.
Yeah. And so it's interesting that people didn't really, did you find people who would talk to you about it? Or do you think that that's just something they've blocked because they can't bear to go back into it?
Yeah, there were 1 or 2 people who would talk about it, but they didn't really want to. I felt that I was slightly forcing them to. And certainly when I talked to a couple of expats living there, they said, well, they don't want to talk about it because they don't want to be overheard in public talking about it. It's still a very top-down society, but people are listening to other people, still a very controlled society. And also because if they have memories of it, it's painful and they don't want to bring that back out again. So I can understand why they wouldn't want to.
Yes. And have newspapers been interested? Or, as you say, has everyone kind of forgotten about this anniversary?
Yes and no. I mean, newspapers, because the readership of newspapers generally is people who remember about the Vietnam War. I think if I was an online writer working with the internet, it's a new generation. I'm not sure if you're under 40, whether you're really aware of the Vietnam War. You might be aware of a couple of the big movies, but to know, I mean, it's a complicated story of why the Americans got involved and who the other parties were. And, you know, there are several decades of previous history that explain it. It's not an easy thing to get a handle on. And there's plenty of other things that happened since. So I think a younger generation may have no concept. But newspapers, because newspapers are generally read by more mature people who have memory of it, they're kind of interested still. They think they should be interested. Although I do find these days that the readership of newspapers may be kind of my market, but the editors generally are much younger. So you have to persuade them that their readers are going to be interested.
I'd be interested for anybody who's watching this today, because with Goldster generation, we all tend to be of an older age group. If people have their own memories of the Vietnam War, or I'd also love to know what you think about the changes in newspapers, because I'm going to ask Andrew that in a minute, about what it's like journalism now as opposed to when you first began. And you were talking about working at the Times and, you know, and having that kind of apprenticeship, really. How different is it now? You've mentioned editors being a lot younger. Do you think there's a big change? Do you think it'll ever change back? Do you think there is a future for newspapers, or will everything go online?
Oh dear, this is a depressing conversation, I think. I mean, it's very hard to see how they can survive in print because the numbers are declining. The graph is just endlessly declining. If you compare to only 10 years ago, you know, some of these newspapers were selling 1 million, 1.5 million 10 years ago. They're now barely over 100,000. I can't see how they are going to survive much more of a decline. They are, of course, making some money from their online sales, but they still generate mainly for print and then put it online. There's very little that's commissioned to the newspaper just for online. So it's a declining market for me. I'm not the new generation of writer who is able to make a presence online, and you have to be able to be a little bit techie and a bit of a salesperson and to understand social media and promote yourself all the time. And all that self-promotion is something I find very hard to do.
Yeah.
I'm old school and I like having the idea and writing the article, and then somebody else looks after all the publishing side of it and the marketing of it and pays me my fee for delivering it. In the modern version of being an influencer or a blogger, you have to do all that delivery and the marketing and the promotion yourself. And that doesn't come naturally to me. So I find it a slightly depressing world to be in. It seems to be a smaller and smaller world. And back in the days when I started as a freelance, I could pretty much go wherever I wanted at the drop of a hat. And there were many, many more pages of a newspaper available to fill. And the PR, public relations business was all too keen, and the tourist board business was all too keen to get you to a destination in the hope of getting into a newspaper. Now they want to have their presence online as much as being in a newspaper, and they only really want to be in a newspaper because it adds a certain top-end credibility to their product. Most of their marketing is online. Yes. So yeah, that's a long answer to because
you just mentioned the tourist boards, and I was interested by this because I was thinking about you saying that you were going to Vietnam because of the anniversary and most people are not talking about it. I just wondered how the tourist board will react, because do they want people who, you know, they've spent a long time promoting Vietnam as a tourist destination? Are they cross with you, do you think, that you're trying to write about this, which I think
I haven't actually had any doings with them, because I'm pretty sure that they would not be interested in helping.
No, I'm sure.
In that respect.
I've had a comment here. I'm old school. I love my daily printed newspaper, and I hope they don't die out. I think that's probably, though we
need more of you.
Yeah. Yes, and you see, I think that too. But then, how frequently do I buy one? I tend to read online.
Yeah, this is the thing.
I hate to admit, but I'm part of the problem. Yeah.
When you go on I just commuted into London this morning. You go on those trains.
Almost no one reading papers.
No, I mean, I guess that some of them have online versions on their phones and they're reading those, but you just don't see, even the free ones, people are not picking them up anymore. They just stay in the bin at the station. Nobody's picking them up. It's an awkward item, I guess. piece
Yeah,
of
you
newspaper.
don't get much room on a train now. Mind you,
No.
I think that with people trying to keep their distance, they might be wanting a
Yes.
broad street again.
Spread out. Yeah.
So we've got another question here. How do you come up with your ideas of what you want to write articles about?
Well, this is always the challenge, because for somebody like me, I'm kind of, there's no continuity in what I do. I don't have a recurring column or anything like that. So it's always whether you've got an idea that hits the moment, that appeals, that that will get you that commission, and you've got to have a familiar enough name to get an editor to read your email when it arrives in their inbox, because some editors will get upwards of 3,000 or 4,000 emails a day.
Yeah.
And they're not going to read all those emails. So the name or the subject line in the email has to really leap out at them, and they'll bother to read the first couple of lines of the email. So that's the challenge. Then I am lucky in a sense that I've been doing this a long time, and what happened a lot in the last few years is these lists: 10 of the best beaches, 10 of the most wonderful autumn weekend cities, that kind of thing. So for an old school guy like me who's been around a lot, I'm quite good at knowing 10 of the best of this, or 10 of the most interesting of that, rather than a young gun who hasn't traveled nearly as widely.
Yeah.
So I can sit at home and do these 10 of the bests quite readily, churn them out. And I think generally newspapers think that they are well read because they are touching a lot of destinations in one article, as opposed to one color feature which will only do one destination.
Mm-hmm.
So it does have a certain amount of public appeal, and that's been a good bread and butter item for me. I've been doing lots of stuff about the most cozy cottages with fireplaces, that sort of thing, in the UK over the pandemic during the lockdowns, for people who just want to stay local. And that's been really useful to keep me going. But now the world is opening up again. I'm back out there pitching things like, with a hook like the Vietnam War. I just did one. I mean, a lot of the stuff I do is slightly quirky and unusual. So I've done a couple of things in the last couple of months that people were never going to do.
Like what?
So, for example, I did the longest public transport journey in Switzerland, which is a post bus. The Swiss have these post buses which go up into the high Alps, into the passes and everything, and they're yellow buses, and they've got this wonderful horn, like a old postman's bugle horn, which sounds really loudly, and you can hear them coming up the valleys. And there's a 14-hour journey on a post bus that goes up and down several of the key passes. So I did that as a story for one of the newspapers, and I know that nobody's going to do that.
I totally would do that. That sounds exactly.
You'd do that, would you?
Yes, totally.
And then I did very recently. I went to the Baltic coast of Germany, where there's a massive building, the longest building in the world, which was built by the Nazis as a holiday camp. It's a holiday resort, and it never went into operation. War broke out before it went into operation, and it then crumbled away in the forest. And in the last 5 years or so, people have bought bits of it up, and they've rebuilt it and remarketed it, and they're selling it as apartments and hotels and all the rest of it. And I went to stay in that and write about that and how it's all come about. And again, I don't think many readers of the newspaper are actually going to go there and book a holiday and stay there, but they're sure as hell pretty curious about things like that.
Yeah. Yes, fascinating. We've got a question that's just come in. What do you find you enjoy reading the most? This is for pleasure rather than for research.
Well, I like reading novels, but we were just discussing this before we came on air. Reading becomes a bit like work sometimes. And reading, I work from home, and if I'm at home, generally I read stuff that relates to work. So I almost need to be somewhere else in order to take on a book and make progress with the book. I'll often have a couple of books by my bedside, but it will take me ages to read them in the house. But once I get moving, so for example, going to Vietnam, I got through 2 books. And both of those books I'd probably had started 6 or 8 weeks ago and not made really any progress with them. So I almost need to be out of the house. Well, long air journeys help, but I need to be out of the house to actually get to grips with the book.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you're thinking about where you're going to travel to, you've said you don't like to go back to places that you've loved. Where are the places that you do return to? Are there some places that you kind of think like go back there again and again, or do you try never to go back to?
No, I will go back to. I'll just go to different parts of places that haven't been destroyed. So I mean, I do like the Far East because it was such a seminal moment in my life, and it kind of was a bit of a launch pad for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it has lovely people, very great, wonderful food, great climate, and some great landscapes and some real adventure still. You know, in the hills of northern Thailand and the forests of northern Thailand and all that sort of stuff, and the islands of Indonesia. There's still some wonderful adventures to be had. So I do tend to go back to the Far East. In Europe, I'm very fond of Transylvania and Romania. I also have a big interest in Germany. So I have a sort of slightly three-pronged career. I'm married to a German, which kind of developed my interest in Germany. And I only became really interested because she comes from a very boring part of Germany in the north. And I kept going there to visit my in-laws and thinking, surely there must be more to Germany than this. So I started exploring other parts of Germany and discovered that it was a great place and it's great value and it has some wonderful landscapes, and it just didn't seem to be getting the coverage that I thought it deserved.
Mm-hmm.
So promoting Germany became a bit of a mission. So I run a website about Germany, which is a second prong to my career. And then I actually have a slight third prong to my career, which is as a rowing coach.
Oh, right. Wow.
Yes. Yeah. So I coach on the river here in London at Chiswick. And actually post-lockdown, when everything started to come back to life, that was the part of my working life that came back first of all, because people suddenly wanted to get out there and do stuff. And the river was there. And it was instantly available, and suddenly there were hordes of people who wanted to learn to row. So that, for the first 6 months post-lockdown, was my mainstay. Now these days, I'm traveling again. It's much harder to do.
I've just posted a link to everybody in the chat to Andrew's website, so you can see all the various different things that he does. We have a comment here. I read the Saturday Telegraph and the local paper, the Oxford Times. So well done. You're doing your piece for buying print journalism. Good.
Right.
So where in the world would you most like to go to that you haven't managed to get to? Is there somewhere that's just kind of the place that's never quite made it into your travel plans yet?
No, not really. There are some parts of the world that I've been to once and thought, no, I really should tackle more of this, but it is such a huge endeavor. South America, particularly. Yeah. I've been there 1.5 times, really. I've been to Mexico, and then I've been to Peru and a little bit of Brazil. And yes, it's great, but it is a very long way away. It is a huge task, and I don't have much Spanish or Portuguese. So I've never really had the keys that unlocked it. And for me, as a writer, it's not very fertile ground. There's not a lot of coverage in the newspapers of South American destinations. So it wouldn't be that productive economically for me. Africa, I've done a fair bits of Africa and always come away feeling that it didn't sit comfortably with me, the big white safari guy going around and seeing the wildlife and not touching the local civilization at all. That never sat comfortably with me. So I'm a little bit reluctant to go to Africa these days. Ethiopia, though, on the other hand, I've never been to Ethiopia, and that has a lot of really interesting cultural stuff with the old churches, rock-cut churches, and I would really like to go there. So that would definitely be on my map. And Far East I've pretty much done. China I've only been to once, and it didn't encourage me to return. Where else? I don't do much in America. Not quite sure why. Maybe because I always feel I can see it on the screen.
Yes,
in movies and on TV programs.
You think we know?
Yeah, I think we know it. Yeah.
There's a question here. Have you ever visited Rothenburg? I'm assuming that's somewhere in Germany.
Yes, on the romantic road. Yes, it's gorgeous. It's a little hilltop town surrounded by walls with vineyards streaming down the sides of the valley, and it's kind of a model for Disney. Disney sent his artists to several German destinations, including Neuschwanstein, which is the big castle down in Bavaria. And that's kind of Disney's model for Sleeping Beauty's castle. And his artists also went to Rothenburg, and any kind of archetypal old village with steepled roofs and walls and things in a Disney film is kind of based on the likes of Rothenburg.
Yeah. But one of your books we haven't touched on, which I really would like to, is Blue River, Black Sea. And I mean, it's looking at the Danube, but also at Patrick Leigh Fermor, who is, for some reason, his name, I just keep coming across his name at the moment. I obviously need to read more of him because his name just keeps popping up. What was it that, like with Agatha Christie, you were inspired to write the 855 to Baghdad? What was it about Patrick Leigh Fermor that drew you to follow in one of his journeys?
Well, I mean, he was an immense adventurer. He set off to do this journey from The Hague to the Black Sea on foot in the dead of winter at the age of 18. And without no real plan, but he had clearly immense charm, and he was able to bump into people in places and just get invited to go and stay with them in their castle, as you do.
He was incredible, wasn't he?
He must have had a magnetic personality.
Yeah.
As a young traveler, and he made this very adventurous journey all the way down, and mostly down the Danube. And when I looked at the Danube on the map, I didn't really realize that it's the only river that goes across Europe, and all the other rivers go up and down. It's the only river that cuts a complete cross-section across the midriff of Europe, and it goes through 11 countries en route to the Black Sea. So I thought, well, that's a wonderful journey in itself. But to follow in his footsteps and try and emulate some of the stuff that he did just gave it that extra spice. So I mean, he did quite a bit of his journey on horseback, for example. So in the end, I ended up doing a very uncomfortable part of my journey. I'm not a natural horseman. And I think the horse realized that very early. So, and then I got myself a job, not really a job, but a role on a freight barge in Serbia going down the river. And then I did quite a lot of the Transylvanian bit on foot through the mountains, avoiding bears and rabid dogs and all that part of it, which is pretty much what he experienced back then. So I wanted to see, because he did the journey in 1936 between the wars, and it was very much then he bumped into old aristocracy. Once he'd met a couple of the aristocrats on the higher parts of the Danube in Germany, they all knew each other, and a lot of them were interrelated family-wise. So they gave him introductions to aristocrats in their castles further down the river. So he basically walked from one castle to another, and when he arrived, there were loads of bored aristocrats sitting in their castle who were only too delighted to welcome this engaging young guy who was very entertaining. So he was a very welcome house guest in all the aristocratic houses from Austria downwards. And all of that had pretty much been swept away by the arrival of communism and the effects of the world wars. So I was curious to see whether any of that still remained. So I went and knocked on some of the ruins to see if there was still a crumbling aristocrat inside there. And one or two of them, certainly in Transylvania, the families which had to leave in a great hurry at the end of the Second World War, some of them have started coming back and rebuilding. So some of those old mansion houses in Transylvania where he stayed now have a descendant of the family back in there again. So there were interesting stories to tell about things.
Did you get invited to stay in castles all the way around, or did you
Didn't
find that?
Actually, no.
Not a single one?
Not a single one. Well, one or two of them now have paying accommodation. So I stayed, but I paid.
You paid.
I'm not charming enough, clearly.
I'm just going to, if you stay with us just a second, I'm just going to tell everyone what's coming up, and then I'm going to come back to you with another couple of questions. So everybody, tomorrow is our book of the month, and we're going to be talking about Appointment with Death, obviously an Agatha Christie. I hope you're not sick of Agatha Christie, but if you are, just come along and tell me how sick you are of Agatha Christie. So that's tomorrow at 12 o'clock, Appointment with Death. And then next week, you've got Adam on Thursday, and he is interviewing Margaret Willis, who is the author of a book called In the Shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral. So it's all about it's all about the whole life around there, the trade that was set up around the cathedral historically, and everything that kind of blossomed in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral. And then I'm back again on Friday, and I'm interviewing Richard Hammond, before you get too excited, not the bloke from Top Gear, the author of The Green Traveller. Richard is he's a wild swimmer. He's a great traveller. I'm sure you probably know his name, Andrew. He's done a lot of really great journeys recently, and the subtitle
Nice guy.
is Conscious Adventure That Doesn't Cost the Earth. He is a lovely guy, isn't he? I worked with him many years ago in our earlier incarnations as book editors together. I haven't seen him for many, many years, and I'm really interested to talk to him about this new book, The Green Traveller. And then the following week, Humphrey is back with you, talking to Robert Sawyer and to Jake Needham, hailed as Asia's most stylish and atmospheric writer of crime fiction. And this coming month, October, we don't actually have a book of the month. So on the last Friday of the month, it'll be me and Humphrey together in conversation with all our book club members, talking about your writing questions, any writing questions that you have. So please do come along to that as well. That's at the last Friday in October. And just to say what's coming up on PPG, our sister channel, on a Tuesday. And next week, I am going to be talking to Denise McGahn. She's a life coach who's written a new book called Midlife, which offers an alternative perspective on middle age and how you can reclaim your identity and create more out of your, come up with more potential. I've said that really badly. She's going to explain it so much better than I can. So Andrew, back to you here. What would you say are your top tips for pitching? If anybody here is watching and they're thinking, oh, that might be quite fun to pitch a travel article, what would you say?
There's got to be a why now, certainly for newspapers. There's got to be, so a section editor has to stand up in front of all the other section editors and say on Monday morning, we're putting this in the newspaper this week because ... It's the latest thing, or it's the new fashion, or it's got a film coming out, or there's a great book, or it's an anniversary. All of those various reasons, that will get somebody to read your pitch. There's got to be a why now, certainly for a newspaper. There are definitely articles that appear in newspapers which are just there because they're lovely, but that will be somebody inviting somebody to go and have a nice free holiday, and the payback is that they have to write about it in the newspaper, and that's usually a staff member who's gone off on a free holiday. But if you're a freelance, you have to have a stronger storyline than that. That's not enough. There's plenty of lovely places in the world, and they regularly get covered. So it's very hard to say, now it's the time to do this particular Caribbean island, because there's lots of lovely Caribbean islands, and the editor will just say, well, why do I need to do this particular Caribbean island now? Yeah. So why now is a very, very important. And then once you've got that established, you have to establish why you're the person to be writing it. You have a personal connection or a recent history or you know, whatever it is. Why you rather than somebody they can contact living there? Because that's the challenge these days of instant and easy communication. They can easily find somebody on the ground there to write it, to get much more up-to-date information, rather than you just been there maybe 6 months ago. Yeah, you have to beat all of those, and then maybe you'll get a commission. So it's not going to be an easy instant thing to do. Right. But can be very, very rewarding if you manage to do it. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been really brilliant talking to you today. And thank you so much for coming on, talking about this gorgeous book. This book is still widely available, but also not in this format so much, but in this format paperback. And in fact, when I tweeted that, I had somebody contact me and say, what an amazing cover that is. So yeah. Thank you very, very much for joining us today, and for coming into the Goldster family. And to everybody who's been watching today, thank you. Come back tomorrow and talk about Appointment with Death. Andrew and I will now turn off our screens and Joe will end the meeting. But take care, everybody. Have a lovely rest of your week, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.